Okay, welcome to another A Tippling Philosopher video. This time I am privileged to welcome onto the show Derreck Bennett, who is, I almost said Derek Lambert there because I've been speaking to him so much, who is someone who I'm fascinated to hopefully get to know better. Our paths are just starting to cross, and actually I first came to know about Derreck through Richard Carrier putting a post up saying that he had been at a conference and heard this absolutely fantastic presentation, and it was by Derreck, and so I was intrigued. And since then, I just seem to see his name popping up everywhere. And I am someone who is basically an ostrich that spends some of my time with my head either up my posterior or in the sand. And so it's fantastic to come into contact with new people and new ideas and new thinkers. So Derreck, first of all, thank you so much for popping on.
So we'll just kick this off. I began my journey by jumping on the internet and discovering the work of Acharya S, of all people, her Truth Be Known website. That was my formal introduction to biblical criticism and comparative religion and whatnot. And then some years later read Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. So if you're watching this now, you're already thinking, oh my goodness, why should I listen to this guy? But that's what sort of piqued my interest in this kind of stuff. And it wasn't long before, because I am the kind of person, I learned years ago in high school in speech and debate that you can't really argue your position unless you understand the opposing view. So it wasn't long before I found myself digging into Christian apologetics, actually, and the work of James Patrick Holding on his Tectonics Ministries website. And I found, by giving them a fair hearing, that a lot of this stuff was bunk. It just wasn't true. And that makes a lot of people who love Zeitgeist really angry with me. But I'm the kind of person who I am a truth seeker first and foremost, before anything else. I'm not a soldier for atheism. I'm just a seeker after truth. And it just so happens that atheism is what I find to be most justifiable in terms of where my beliefs lie. That's how.
Yeah, I had a few interactions with JP Holding years back when people used to comment more on Amazon reviews. They've stopped commenting now, enabling comments on Amazon reviews. That used to be the forum where I first was interacting with Christians in a meaningful way. And interacted with him, how I got arguments with him, and I was starting to write books. And then so Richard Carrier came along and wrote Not the Impossible Faith as a refutation of JP Holding's positions. He was commissioned to write that book, and it's actually a really good book. In fact, I go as far as to say it's possibly Carrier's best book. Like, I think it's hugely undervalued as a book, Not the Impossible Faith. But anyway, yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, we all have our different journeys into what we do, don't we? And they start somewhere and then they manifest themselves in different ways and they grow. So where are you now? What do you involve yourself with on a weekly basis as far as your
Well, I mean, just to kind of play quick catch up, eventually I began to discover actual legitimate scholarship on these matters and learned the value of seeking out the primary sources, ancient texts and iconography, and how to actually legitimize what it is you're talking about. And if it's not evidenced, if it's not supported by relevant scholarship, it needs to be tossed out. So I stick to the scholarship and the primary sources, and I don't. I may provide some of my own unique perspective and inferences, but I don't go terribly far beyond the bounds of what the texts and the scholarship had to say. And they alone have some pretty interesting things to say and some pretty darn interesting implications. So I've been a big
main source
fan of Robert M. Price for years.
What would be your main primary sources? So what are we talking about? What country? What era? What's your main sphere of interest?
So as it relates to, I would say that I am an independent student. Perhaps you could even say scholar. I've been studying this stuff for over 15 years now. My expertise lies in comparative religion as it relates to Judeo-Christianity and the Bible. So we're talking the era of, anywhere from the ancient Near East on up to the Greco-Roman and Hellenistic world. That's where my focus primarily lies.
Interesting. So actually, yeah, I'm presently writing a book that is acting as a third pillar of a trilogy of books. First one I wrote was on the Nativity, second one on the Resurrection, and this third one is on the Exodus. And in writing that, I'm co-authoring it with an archaeologist over in Canada, Rebecca Bradley, and I'm loving really getting into the Old Testament exegesis and the history and the archaeology. And in fact, I think it floats my boat that little bit more than New Testament stuff. There are just more genres at play. Whereas New Testament exegesis is much more about theology, a little bit about history, but it's mainly just kind of theology and criticism of the gospel sources and that kind of exegesis. Whereas, as I say, the Old Testament is just loads of different genres hitting you. You've got your comparative mythology, and you've got your history of the ancient Near East, and you've got archaeology, and then you've got Egyptology, and it's just fascinating.
And that's almost a jumping point right there. I mean, just so our viewers know, we kind of decided to do this interview sort of last minute, and we wanted to see where the conversation would lead. So that should be interesting to see where this takes off and where we can go from here in the future. But as it relates to what you're talking about, getting into exegesis and the history of the Hebrew Bible, one of the things that's fascinating to me, I listen to and study a lot of apologetics regarding comparative religion, because again, I want to give it a fair hearing, but at the same time, I find that they are, there's so much axe grinding and bias that they just can't get it right. Surprise, surprise. But one of the defenses that they often use is to say, well, this stuff that you see in Christianity in the New Testament, it's not Greco-Roman, it's not Hellenistic, it's not pagan, because it's thoroughly Jewish. They use Judaism as sort of the buffer to defend it against any kind of intrusion from paganism, Hellenism, or anything like that. It doesn't work because it's a bifurcation fallacy. Essentially, Christianity is basically a confluence of Greco-Roman, Hellenistic, and Jewish ideas, if you ask me. But the problem with this argument, in addition to that, is that Judaism itself was a synthesis of ancient Near Eastern beliefs. And I'm sure you've discovered that yourself by delving into some of this stuff. I mean, as we know, the Israelites were an indigenous tribe of Canaanites. We've proven this from genetics now. It's a fact. And we do see elements of ancient Canaanite religion and even the Baal cycle in the Old Testament. It's interesting if you study the works of John Day and even John Levinson, the early in the Hebrew Bible, which were they had to do with the restoration of Israel. Even that stuff, there is a tie-in and a link with the death and resurrection of Baal, so that you could say, even though I tend to shy away from insisting upon genetic influences between the resurrection of Christ and of these other divinities, but you could say through via a circuitous route, via cultural diffusion, with Judaism as the conduit, that the death and resurrection of Baal did sort of.
I think because your bandwidth is a bit low there is some breaking up of what you were saying. Just to recap what you were saying, that the Baal cycle and the idea of resurrection within the Baal mythology can be said to arguably have some influence on the Christian story itself of Jesus'
Yes.
resurrection. And I think the ancient Near East, I think if you fail to see the Hebrew Bible set, solidly in the context of the ancient Near East, especially where you've got the Jewish people in exile in Babylonia, and therefore picking up a lot of the surrounding culture and the surrounding mythology, understandably so, obviously so, you would predict that, right? But then obviously Christians who want to defend, or Orthodox Jews who want to defend the kind of biblical exceptionalism of the Hebrew Bible will say, no, it's not, we've got primacy here. And there's a kind of it's just a flat denial of what is obviously true. And I wonder, here's a question for you, because I wonder, on the one hand, and I respect a lot of, say, Bob Price's work, but on the one hand, I think there is a potential to throw as much stuff at the wall to see what fits, right? And occasionally some things will stick. So what sticks? And occasionally some things will stick. But the problem is, when you throw everything at the wall, it kind of devalues that which does stick. And perhaps theists look at the extreme of comparative mythologists and say, oh, it's obviously nonsense because look what they're doing. They're trying to make this fit, this fit, this fit, and this fit. Whereas actually in reality, maybe only one or two of those things do fit, but they throw the baby out with the bathwater. So they throw the things that really are robust out, as well as the stuff that isn't, because some people are trying to throw too much at comparative mythology. Would that be fair?
Absolutely fair. And I appreciate you saying as much. We have to be careful understanding epistemology and how that works. There's only so much that we can know for certain, and some things you have to make statements based on probability. And yeah, you can't just you don't want to engage in parallelomania. By seeing parallels in every single source or reference that you dig up. But you also want to be careful not to indulge in parallelophobia either, as many Christian apologists do, and I find even Bart Ehrman doing. You have to find kind of a happy medium and strike a balance, and that's what I try to do. And I perhaps, I might have opened too big a can of worms by talking about the possible genetic influence of the death and resurrection of Baal, but for the most part, I try to see a lot of this stuff as simply analogs to the myths surrounding Jesus and other such tales in the Bible. It's probably more appropriate to say that the kind of claims, the kind of myths and narratives and legends you find in the Bible are cut from the same cloth of the ancient Mediterranean world. But it's not, I mean, if you're imagining the Apostle Paul or any of the gospel authors sitting down with the gospel of the pagans and copying things verbatim, you always hear the term copycat used by apologists. That's not an appropriate way to talk about these things. Rather, it's when you're looking at the Bible, the stuff is analogous to the kind of stuff you find in the ancient world, in ancient literature, and ancient religion. And it's part of the same general thought world. It's part of the mythic consciousness of the times. M. David Litwa does a fantastic job explaining this in Isus Deus, the early Christian depiction of Jesus as a Mediterranean god. So it's understanding these things as springing from the same time and place in history, the same collective mentality of the ancients, rather than a conspiracy, you know what I mean, or anyone doing verbatim copying or plagiarizing, if that makes sense.
I think that there are several options going on here. So I think on the one hand, there are times when one myth or one story or one narrative is copying another narrative, but then you need to look out for the differences. So there is a kind of like, right, we're going to take this idea and we're going to run with that whole story because that story is so prevalent and so famous and everyone knows it. And you see this from within the Bible. So stories take, like the New Testament will take stories from the Hebrew Bible and then replay them out through Jesus, but it's about what you change, right? So the meaning comes from what you change. So the flood myth of Noah is taking on the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's taking on the ATHEOLOGICA, and it's changing the theology by saying actually God is because of the wickedness of humanity, and it's this, and there's this connection between a kind of morality and a human and a divine, maybe, or omnibenevolence, or some kind of moral framework that the God has, rather than it's just being noisy humans, as we saw in the Gilgamesh. So you've got on the one hand, you've got this, right, I'm going to take this story and I'm going to copy it, but maybe change it a little bit. But there's also this other idea that stories create a general cultural background, a milieu in which motifs are prevalent, right? So you're talking about, say, the Baal cycle. It might not be that Jesus is copying any aspects of Baal in particular, but it's that those kind of myths that exist, or those cultural stories and narratives that exist, present a kind of landscape or a pick and mix where you can take like elements of stories that are just really common motifs that are just out there, and then you're applying that to your story. It doesn't mean that you're copying that other story necessarily, but you are drawing from the well of motifs.
That is exactly right. I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself. That is absolutely on point. And that's what too many Christian apologists in particular don't seem to understand. They seem to willingly misunderstand by foisting something of a straw man argument, suggesting that we are talking about, plagiarization or copycatting. Rather, we are talking about something much more organic and natural, not conspiratorial. And what you said is really on point when it comes to the ancients' ability to adopt and adapt motifs, to put their own spin on things and to innovate. That's a lot of what they did, and we see that quite clearly. I have to laugh when I hear N.T. Wright's argument that the resurrection of Jesus could not have spawned from mere Second Temple Jewish beliefs about resurrection, because that was only with regard to the mass resurrection of everyone at the eschaton. So the belief in Jesus' resurrection cannot have come from that, because they never imagined this happening to a single individual at a time. Are you kidding me? As if the ancients were not able to modify pre-existing ideas. I mean, we do this in the modern day. It's just a ridiculous argument. It's a non sequitur. We even see.
It's not too dissimilar from the idea that humans at the time, Jewish people at the time, just wouldn't have been able to understand the notion that slavery was bad. So God was unable to deliver this moral proclamation that, do you know what, slavery is bad. Deal with it. I'm God and I'm telling you this. And if you don't get this, I'll strike you down. If you don't adhere to my rules, I'll strike you down. So slavery is bad. But he doesn't do that. And because he doesn't do that, because no one thought slavery was particularly morally bad at those times. So the modern Christian or Jew has to go, well, the reason that God didn't deliver that is because they would have understood this new paradigm that slavery is bad. It's nonsense. It's not in the same way that you're saying, it's not as if they wouldn't have understood that this is a manipulation of that story for a particular end.
And of course, my other favorite response to this, happened to hear from sort of run-of-the-mill Christians with regard to slavery and such, is that, well, those were different times. and you've just invoked moral relativism, argument for an objective morality stemming from God.
A guy called Justin Schieber called that, which I now use the term, intercovenantal moral relativism or intertestamental moral relativism. And I love that term, is to say, okay, you're arguing for divine command theory, you're arguing for this kind of objective moral stance. And yet at the same time, you're saying, do you know what? It was bad to eat shellfish there, but it's fine now. That's just moral relativism, right? So yeah, I agree with you.
Right. Trying to have it both ways, have your cake and eat it too. One thing I should clarify for anyone watching this, again, I can't stress enough that I try to take a fair and balanced view of things, even though the phrase fair and balanced has been so abused in our time and place in history that it might be hard to take that term seriously. But you know, I'm only going to, like I said, I'm a truth seeker first and foremost, and an atheist second. You know, if I were to discover evidence for God or evidence that Christianity is true, then I would, you know, that's where I'd be. I mean, clearly that's not where I am, because that's not where the evidence and the arguments lead. But in so doing, you know, a lot of people will watch this and think, oh, this guy's a mythicist. In fact, he contributed a chapter to Robert Price and John Loftus's Varieties of Jesus Mythicism. In fact, I'm not a mythicist, and therefore it's really not out of keeping for me to have a chapter in that book, because it is varieties of Jesus mythicism. In other words, I actually lean toward historicity. I think that there probably was a historical Jesus, but that the depiction of him that we have in the New Testament is something of an amalgam of the kind of prevalent mythic and legendary beliefs of the time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there was not a historical personage behind the veil, however little we can actually know of him. So, you know, I know mythicism is popular. I mean, I will be so bold to say that I think that it is popular and that it is trendy, but what's popular is not always right, and what's right is not always popular. Yeah. And so I tend to think, just objectively looking at things, that I'm going to follow the arguments and evidence wherever they lead.
Yeah, I generally, I completely agree with you. I think probably we're on exactly the same page here. And what I think might be interesting, I don't know what your chapter is in Loftus's and Price's book, but I imagine it would look something like this, because I was reading Jesus Christ from Outer Space by Richard Carrier recently, and I was reading it all and just loving it, thinking this is spot on, this is spot on, this is spot on. But actually, it would apply to a Jesus who was just a very small nugget of a kernel of a historical truth just as well. Because I believe that there's this tiny nugget of truth. I mean, it's a bit like Bart Ehrman says, you get these gist memories where we can probably say Jesus was from Nazareth. I think we've got good reason to believe that's probably historically true. He did come to Jerusalem. He did get crucified, right? So you've got these really core basic facts, but everything else, pretty much everything else, is mythologized over it. And so therefore, when you're talking about Jesus mythicism, I agree with you that it's all mythicism as applied to Jesus. It's just that there's this nugget at the bottom, and effectively our positions are synonymous with each other. We both believe, historicists and mythicists, that broadly, at least most of the Gospels are myth, right? It just so happens that I'm going to tag on that there was a guy. He was probably a preacher, an itinerant preacher, who gathered a following, went to Jerusalem, pissing people off, got executed, and then everything else is myth.
And I should clarify also that I'm not an anti-mythicist, no, as some are. I'm not virulently opposed to these people. I love Richard Carrier's work. He is, for me, a mentor. I have learned immensely from Carrier. So I'm not going to come out there guns a-blazing saying, oh, the heck with Carrier and Price and all these guys. I love these guys. I have stood at the feet of these guys, metaphorically, and learned an immense amount from them. So if you are a mythicist, I have no beef with you whatsoever. I could be wrong and you could be right. It's certainly plausible. I just tend to err on the side of historicity, and there are various reasons for that, which we don't have to necessarily get into. Yeah, I refuse to have any kind of flame war with mythicists, because I'm not, I'm not anti-mythicist, and I'm not absolutely convinced that they're wrong either.
Yeah,
for what that's worth.
So totally agree with you. And in fact, I'd say, in the same way that Carrier says he's a mythicist by sort of 67% to 33%, mythicist, historicist. I'm a 67% historicist to 33% mythicist. But I won't, like I keep saying, I won't die on that hill, just like you. I'm not overly bothered because actually it makes no difference to my worldview. I don't have a horse in that race, and so if Jesus was completely myth,
exactly,
yeah, if it was completely myth, interesting. It's really interesting. If he's a historical kernel, right. Interesting. Do you know what? It makes no difference. I just think it's slightly more realistic to think that there was just this human base of the belief system, but meh, whatever.
I mean, it's what's the term? You're right in line with my way of thinking. I don't hold any of this as a dogma. And at the end of the day, as to whether or not there was a historical Jesus, it's an interesting question. I'm certainly have an academic and intellectual curiosity, but at the end of the day, like, let's just come right out with it emotionally. I don't care. I just don't care. And that's the kind of person you kind of want to speak on these issues. It's because I don't have a horse in this race. It's because I'm not emotionally invested that I can investigate this fairly objectively. But at the end of the day, as to whether or not there was a guy, I just don't care. I find it interesting. I'm curious, but I have nothing invested in this. It's not a dogma, and there's no horse in the race for me. Now, my chapter in this forthcoming book, and I also give a presentation on this. It's a PowerPoint presentation, which is I know Carrier praised it to the skies. Others really seem to enjoy it as well, including David Fitzgerald. The presentation is called "Resurrection and Apotheosis in Pre-Christian Antiquity," and the chapter in Loftus and Price's book is titled. It's something that mythicists, it's one of their major talking points, even though I find that it doesn't necessarily entail mythicism. But I do support the idea that, yes, there were dying and rising gods, resurrected or apotheosized or immortalized heroes and kings and divinities. John Granger Cook wrote a 700 plus page tome on the whole notion of resurrection and apotheosis, was published in 2018. This argument from apologists that you often hear that this stuff is outdated, it hails from the 19th and 20th century. It's since been completely rebutted by Jonathan Z. Smith and others. And the consensus of scholarship is that this just isn't a thing anymore. Well, that's just, there's some truth to that. It's just not entirely true. Yes, J.Z. Smith did sort of put something of a death nail in the whole idea of James Frazer's concept of dying and rising gods back in the late 80s and early 90s. But since then, scholars are looking at this stuff. They're taking just a new approach to it and saying, Smith might have gone too far the other way. For those watching, James Frazer in The Golden Bough was the one who more or less introduced on a popular level this idea, this is back in the 19th century, that there were dying and rising gods prior to Christ. And then a more recent scholar of religion, brilliant scholar of religion, Jonathan Z. Smith, wrote Drudgery Divine and an encyclopedia entry in one of Mircea Eliade's publications, basically refuting James Fraser's concept of dying and rising gods and saying this isn't really a thing. When you take a closer look at the actual ancient texts, this is overblown. And to some extent, Fraser did have this overblown and made some errors. But more and more, you find scholars looking at Jonathan Z. Smith and saying, whereas Fraser might have taken this too far in one direction, Smith took it too far in the other direction. He did sort of a root and branch upheaval and refutation of Fraser, but went just a little too far. The fact of the matter is, when we look at the ancient texts and we argue this stuff out logically, we find that there absolutely were various divinities, like kings and heroes, who were, like I said, either raised from the dead in some form or immortalized and apotheosized in such a way that is eerily similar to the depiction of Christ in the New Testament.
I think there's a lot to be said for the mantra that everything in moderation. Do you know what? I think there's a few times you said this and that today where like it's not this extreme, not that extreme, it's somewhere in the middle. And actually, it's not to say everything's always in the middle, but there is good caution in suspecting both extremes sometimes.
If you've got parallelomania on the one hand, but then there's parallelophobia on the other. Interesting factoid, the man who coined the term parallelomania, that was Rabbi Samuel Sandmel. I have one of his books, A Jewish Understanding of the New Testament. And granted, he coined this term and spoke of parallelomania, where oftentimes scholars and even pseudo-scholars of religion make too much of parallels and exaggerate some things. He nevertheless absolutely understood Christianity as a mystery religion in the Apostle Paul's hands. He even says that the attempts by apologists and so forth to try and divorce Christianity from the ancient mysteries are grotesque. So it's not as though he didn't see any value to comparative religion and the whole idea of religious syncretism. He absolutely did. He just said it could be taken too far.
Yeah, I've been reading, there's a Zevit edited book called Subtle Citation, Allusion and Translation in the Hebrew Bible, which talks a lot about, I think there's some chapters in there about parallelomania and parallelophobia. So yeah, definitely is really important. I think what the other sort of forms of parallel, so when you're talking about Jesus, it's not just about is the Jesus divine figure, Messiah or God, is that copying previous God stories and narratives and myths? Because I think one of the most obvious allusions that Jesus is making, or the gospel authors were making, was in Moses, in looking at Hebrew Bible figures themselves. It's not so much that Jesus is this copy of a god, but actually he's just an emulation of Moses, or just taking Moses, because let's remember the audience for Jews. So certainly for Matthew, so if his audience are Jews and he's going to convince them that Jesus is super cool, important, the Messiah, then he's got to make Jesus to be better than who they think is their number one Jew, which is Moses. So it's like, let's use the narrative of Moses and we'll use that as a skeleton for Jesus's narrative, and then Jesus becomes a new Moses, but he's just a little bit better.
Yeah, a lot of this is what we call competitive assimilation. Again, this is something that David Litwick covers really well in Isaiah's Deuce. I mean, again, even though I'm cautious about drawing genetic parallels, saying that this was necessarily influenced by other myths, with Asclepius, I'm pretty sure the New Testament authors were aware of Asclepius and the Asclepions, and we find Jesus in the Gospel of John healing a man. It was a man or woman at the pool of Bethesda, which was one of the cult centers of Asclepius. And it's a way of saying Asclepius can't really do this stuff, but Jesus is the real deal. There's just no way they weren't aware of this stuff, and that they were taking ideas about Asclepius, but we're saying our God can do one better. So to some extent, yeah, there is influence, unquestionably. I just try to be very cautious about making such assertions. And then, to really tie in with some of the stuff you do, I have to be honest and admit that I haven't read any of your books yet. My apologies, but I'm very much aware of you, and that's why I was extremely excited to wake up to your message this morning. I was like, John O. Pierce, heck yeah. I know of you from Myth Vision, and I know Carrier is a big fan of your work, so I know who you are, and I'm a big fan, and I do need to dig into some of your published works for sure. But you get into countering resurrection apologetics, which I'm a big fan of that kind of stuff, and a lot of what you discuss is the prior probability of the resurrection, which, I mean, let's be frank, people tend not to read. There it is. Yes, that's the book I really need to get a hold of. People tend not to rise from the dead. We don't have any contemporary experience of such phenomena. So yes, it absolutely is skeptical. Robert M. Price talks about the principle of analogy, which is, unless we invent a time machine, we can't go back in 2,000 years ago and see for ourselves what actually happened. So we can only assess this based on probability. And the principle of analogy is one of the tools that historians use to try and assess these things. People tend not to rise from the dead, ever. So we have no contemporary experience of such phenomena. We have nothing from our background knowledge that tells us that this is probable or viable. So if we find no analogy to real world experience, is there anywhere else where we do find analogy? Yes, we do, in ancient myth and legend. That's not an argument from borrowing or genetic influence or copycatting or anything like that. It's just to say the principle of analogy is just a fancier way of saying, what does this look like? Does it look like the kinds of things that we experience in the real world, or does it look like ancient myth and legend? And if you're being honest with yourself, it looks like an ancient myth and legend. That's analogy propels us to the matching genre, so to speak, as Price says. That's where you have. Go ahead.
That's one of the problems with Bayesian analysis. I remember John Loftus writing a piece on this, just saying that you can't really effectively use Bayesian analysis when you've got no prior example of something happening. So you can't work out a prior probability is that if it's literally never happened before. So you're plugging a zero into a calculation, which is going to give you a sort of, it's not going to give you an answer. It's not going to give you an actual probability. And there's a lot of truth to that. So yeah, then you have to go to saying, okay, well, if we've never experienced this before, then instead of the zero, let's have an infinitesimally small number that can represent the zero. Right. Or you find ways around this, or you appeal to analogy, or there are other ways of looking at a kind of Bayesian analysis.
Right. And so that's the most obvious and immediate implications of my work when it comes to other resurrected, dying, and rising figures, is that it's not even necessary to argue borrowing or genetic influence. It's only to say that, look, we only know about such phenomena from ancient myth and legend. What must it be then? I mean, that's what it most looks like. Now, apologists know that when it comes to prior probability, regardless of the fact that it may be astonishingly low, they argue that, yes, but we can overcome this if we have enough evidence. If the evidence and the arguments are such that you just have to say prior probability be damned, when you look at the evidence, it really strongly suggests that Jesus was resurrected. Of course, this is, the problem of prior probability is, what they won't be honest about is that this is a mountain that they've got to climb. I mean, for such an extraordinary claim, you better have some damn compelling evidence. It had better be, the folks who try to argue that extraordinary claims don't require extraordinary evidence, it ought to be compelling. It ought to be sufficient. So if I can just, they go into their litany.
if I can just say that it's so intuitively true. Like everyone uses that every day. Like I said this on Derek Lambert interviews, and all I've said in my book is that we use extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence every day. Like if I'm going to come up and tell you that I just flew to the moon yesterday, you know, without any assistance, just me like Superman flew to the moon, you would rightfully ask for an absolute shed load of evidence to support that. Yet if I said to you I went shopping yesterday, you would believe that just on verbal testimony alone. So we do this, we use this, it's obvious, right? But what I find interesting is that even if the Christian says, okay, so these are extraordinary claims, but do you know what? The Gospels are extraordinary evidence. Even if the Gospels are as good evidence as the Christians think they are, I still don't think it justifies belief in what they say. So I know this sounds like there's no way that a Christian can be justified in their beliefs, but actually it's possibly true. There possibly is no way that the Gospels alone could justify any extraordinary claims of the type that they do, and we would no matter what be warranted in disbelieving until we had other supporting things.
But to be fair, I always try to give them a fair hearing. I absolutely look at the stuff. I have studied the apologetics regarding in favor of the historicity of the resurrection, and if I may be frank, they're bad. They're not good. They are utterly, they're either invalid or unsound, or both. Some of the facts they just get completely wrong, and some of the logic is just it's not valid. It's not good. I mean, we could spend all day talking about this stuff. Let's tackle one of their favorites is the 1 Corinthians 15 creedal statement, and how Paul, of course, attests to being a witness of the risen Christ. But when he's providing this creedal list, which includes Peter and James and the others, well, he had met with Peter and James on his trip to Jerusalem per Galatians. He must be he must have gotten this list directly from them. Of course, he doesn't tell us that, and but he must be reporting. I mean, he wouldn't be reporting something that they themselves had not actually vouched for, you know. So this is an attestation that Peter and James must also have claimed to have seen, witnessed the risen Christ. I mean, okay, even if we go that far, again, it's funny because the principle of analogy still comes to bear on a lot of this stuff, and I'll explain why. When you look at early Mormonism, you have multiple witnesses claiming to have seen the angel Moroni. We have far more evidence for people having witnessed the angel Moroni in am I still with you here? Is my internet still stable?
Yeah,
because it's giving me a signal that it's not. Am you still hearing me?
Yeah, no, you've been
okay.
Dodgy the whole time.
But, we have far more. Good. Far more testimonial evidence for people having witnessed the angel Moroni in early Mormonism than we do for people having witnessed the risen Christ. And yet none of these guys, unless they're actually Mormons, would actually say that's enough to convince them that early Mormons truly witnessed the angel Moroni. What was it? What did they see? Was it hallucinations, mistaken identity? Was it completely deceptive, fraudulent? Who knows? I don't know, and I don't care. It's still not enough. I'm pretty sure these guys were full of it, and they would agree. But when it comes to their particular religion, they make an exception. It's all special pleading, every single bit of it.
It's interesting because when it comes to the Mormon case, in my book on the resurrection, I do look at the fact that indeed after that, some of those closest to Joseph Smith ended up basically admitting that they were lying. So we've got an example that we can draw on for probability's sake of the fact that people are making miraculous claims, and that we are more justified in believing that they were lying than those miraculous claims actually took place. And in fact, Mormonism can enlighten us quite a lot on how we can start evaluating the Jesus claims. So it's a really interesting parallel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and several of them, because I've actually looked at the Mormon apologetics, even though they parted with Smith, they stuck to their testimony. They said, yeah, no, we absolutely saw this stuff. Do you believe them? I mean, who knows what happened? Who knows what they saw or think they saw, or whether they were lying? But it's we disbelieve it for the same reason that it's the principle of analogy. It's prior probability. It's like, yeah, you probably did really see an angel, and yeah, whether we really truly indeed have attestation of Peter, James, or anyone having seen the risen Christ, probably not. This was probably more a matter of cognitive dissonance reduction and looking to the Hebrew scriptures to sort of reconcile a recent tragedy, that being their messianic hopeful tragically meeting with his demise, not something that was predicted in the Hebrew Bible, though they later took those passages and put a new theological spin on them. So, and we can get into all kinds of stuff. I mean, oh gosh, women, the testimony of women. I mean, women weren't trusted in the ancient world by the criterion of embarrassment. This must be a stubborn fact of history. Stop it. Women were most commonly associated with lamentation and burial and anointing procedures. It would be weirder. It would really fit the criterion of embarrassment if they had men going to the tomb. Not that men never did this, sometimes they did, but women were most commonly associated with such procedures. So naturally, if you're telling a story about people going to the tomb to anoint the body, it's going to be women. These weren't Palestinian legal documents. They were more like Hellenistic prose novels. These arguments are bunk. We could go on and on about just how bad they are.
Yes. So but due to the fact that I am going to have to shoot off now and do an actual job, we'll bring it to a close now. But what we've done is we've just had a nice little chat about all sorts of random stuff, but hopefully gives some kind of foundation to where we might want to take the conversation when we next meet again on the virtual airwaves. But I just want to say, so thank you, Derek. It's been really interesting. And I think we are people who probably agree an awful lot on everything. So
yeah, this has been an absolute pleasure. Like I said, I was ecstatic to wake up to your message first thing this morning. I mean, it was a no-brainer for me to hop on air with you. I know we kind of decided to do it last minute, but it's been fun. I think it's still been worthwhile, and we got to do this again for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Okay, man. Well, look, you take care. Thank you very much.